Johnson, and I teach in the College of Law here at Syracuse University, and also co-direct the Cold Case Justice Initiative. And along with our college, along with the university, and those who have sponsored the visit of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Syracuse University for these 2 days, we all wish to welcome you and also to welcome our guests on the panel, in the panel discussion that we will be having in just moments. Let's welcome Martin Luther King III to our campus. And let us also welcome Ambassador Andrew Young to our campus. The title of this program, as you all are aware, is "The Past is Not Past, the Continuing Quest for Racial Justice," and we'll speak again later this evening. We thought, and I didn't mention Professor Janice McDonald, who is also at the law school, professor at the law school and co-director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative, and also Professor Linda Carty, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies. As the three of us were discussing the impending visit by the Dalai Lama, we also thought that this presented a good opportunity for us concerns, experiences of racial injustice, and the desire for all peoples to have peace, to experience peace. Sometimes it can be peace in relation to justice means for all of us. And so we are hoping that in dialogue with you, in dialogue with our panelists, that we this week, Sam and Carol Nappy, whom you are probably aware, have produced sponsored the Dalai Lama's visit, and also have been on in the present time. And as we are hoping to discuss with you today, we'll see how those continuing effects and manifestations of racial violence affect us and the conditions of Black people, people of color broadly, and poor people in this society continue to have a vexing impact on our lives, and again, on all of our desires in search for peace. So what we would like to do this afternoon then is have a roundtable discussion in which we will ask our panelists to engage in some of these questions, give us our thoughts, give us their thoughts on these questions, and also have questions from each of you so that we have time for genuine dialogue around these issues. Let me introduce to you first Mr. King. Martin Luther King III figures in civil rights, human rights throughout the history eras of this nation. Mr. King has been elected to public office. He has served in political office in the state of Georgia. He also has been on the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that his father was one of the founders of. He founded a of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And continued in that role with the children of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King. He is an ordained minister. He also has served many years in public life as a civil rights activist, as mayor of Atlanta, as a congressman, and also as United Nations ambassador. The Bounce TV, which is an international nonviolence education workshop and program offerings that will be presented through that project. I'd like to next introduce Dr. Linda Carty. Dr. is the director of the graduate program in the Department of African American Studies. Her teaching areas regard race throughout the African diaspora and also gender and sexuality issues in the study of African peoples throughout the United States and across the diaspora. Her research reflects these interests as well, and she is a noted advocate and activist scholar. Please welcome Dr. Linda Carty. Jan, and who doused his shoe shop with a flammable liquid such that he was unable to escape and suffered the burns from that. When his family asked us if we could help them to get answers about what had happened in his case, that began our journey to helping not only the Frank Morris family, but also many others under similar circumstances for whom justice has not come, and in many cases there were never any investigations on their deaths. So we and our students are investigating those cases. Please welcome Professor Janice McDonald.
Okay, good afternoon. It is certainly a distinct honor to be back at Syracuse, and of course to be with Professor Johnson and Professor McDonald and Professor Cardy and each of you, along with Ambassador Young, who Ambassador Young and I were with Professor McDonald and Professor Johnson several months back last year. So we're honored to be here today. Is it possible for peace to exist without justice? And I think that really depends on what we mean by peace, because, you know, we live in a nation, interestingly enough, that purports to have justice. And we do have justice for some, but not justice for all. We have a criminal system, I think. But our criminal system, because of its structure, does not allow for true justice to exist for everyone. Now, what do I mean by that? It should be crystal clear that something is wrong with the justice system when 13% of the population, being African American, comprise 60, 70, 80% of the jail population. And that I'm not suggesting that there are not people who need to be in jail. But I am suggesting that it's interesting that in a humorous way, Richard Pryor, many years, the late, great Richard Pryor, captured it by saying, when you go down to the courthouse looking for justice, all you'll find is just us. That's a tragic commentary, but a true commentary. But the reality is, if there was a system that where there was more indigent defense, I mean, people who do not have resources. The reason the jail is comprised of people who are African American, 60% plus some cases, often a significant number of Latino and Hispanics, and then poor whites. That's what our jails are full of. And if people were able to get true justice, and I'm just talking about in that one regard, I think that dynamic could change. But also there's a racial dynamic. One day we have to get beyond race. Everything is not race. Everything that happens in our society is not predicated on race. But there are racial dynamics because we are programmed to believe that certain individuals within our society are committing crimes. Therefore, policemen target them. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that they've been programmed to do that. And so there's a disproportionate number of people who are stopped who happen to be African American. In New York City, you've heard of the stop and frisk laws. 600,000 people stopped and frisked, most of them being African, many of them being African American and Latino and Hispanic. And yet, less than 10% of those that they stopped were they able to find something on them that they did not, should not have had. It was way less than 10%, probably less than 5%. My point is, we've got to figure out how do we modify and integrate our entire society. How do we create a just climate for everyone from the justice system? And then at the same token, how do we create a peaceful environment? So I don't know that we certainly won't be able to have true peace without justice. We need and I was just dealing with one. I only wanted to deal with that one dynamic of justice. There's other justice that needs to exist. So I do not believe we really can have ultimately true peace without having justice, and that's justice across the board.
And Mr. King was on that panel as well. I listened intently as the question was about peace, and His Holiness said peace really comes from within. You know, if one has peace within oneself, one would really be thinking of the world in a more holistic way. That's my paraphrasing of what he said. And if I care about myself, I would care about you. And so we would have a much more a society of the other. Then we wouldn't, if we took that to its ultimate conclusion, we wouldn't have wars. We wouldn't have wars that are really predicated on issues of race and looking at people of color more than anyone else in the society, predominantly blacks and Latinos. We have a really large percentage, as you said, of African Americans in the criminal expect to go to prison at some time in his lifetime, 1 in 3. In the last 30 years, the percentage of women in prison has increased 800%. 800%. It's the fastest growing population in the United States, the fastest growing incarcerated population in the United States. The rate of men in the U.S., and most of them are women of color, particularly black and Latina. These are numbers that everybody should be aware of, but aren't. These are numbers that the state is aware of, but we see little violent offenses, and for extensive periods of time. The growth of private prisons in this country shows that incarceration is recognized as an industry. And so now we have prison for profit, and for them to improve their lives through a college education. There's the violence and the achievement gap. One of the things about education in this country is the achievement gap between rich and poor is widening substantially, widening as time goes on. And between rich students and poor students in U.S. schools across the country in every state. When we look at healthcare, we see that there's so much, the healthcare system is replete with racialized understandings. And so there's people of color who have less opportunity to get good health care in this country because of skin color. You know, I often say to my students that, what is racism that we don't want to talk about in the country anymore? Well, racism is white skin privilege, right? It's white skin privilege based on whiteness. It's not about not liking white people or white people not liking people of color. It's about certain people having privileges just based on skin color, which I was talking about just today in my class earlier. Should I stop now? And then we have the violence of education, the substandard education, as I pointed out before. So there's the violence of poverty, there's the violence of substandard education, there's the violence of incarceration, and the list goes on. So as I was listening to the panel yesterday, I was thinking, well, what about all these variables? Should we talk about these? Or are we talking about peace in absolutist terms without looking at nuances? I don't think that's what the panel was doing. But as this panel is trying to do is look at some of these issues that are really major obstacles to peace. One of the speakers said yesterday, and I thought this was really interesting, when he said, how do we talk about peace to people who are hungry, right? And he was addressing this internationally. How would you talk about peace in the face of so much injustice and poverty with so much unequal incomes across the world? But if we look at the United States, we say across the United States. What does this mean? It means that poverty is created, right? It means poverty largely is created by the state. What do we want to talk? Do we want to talk about that? Or what can we do about that? And what kind of peace can we accomplish in a society where there's so much intense social inequality?
Okay, so we will come back to
and for having a completely different view. And it's based on my own experience. And the only way I have survived to 80 years is that when I was 4 years old, right on the corner of my house was the headquarters of the Nazi Party. And they were Heil Hitler, and no air conditioning, so I could see them. My daddy took me to the movie to see Jesse Owens. And he said, see, Jesse Owens won a race, and Hitler got up and walked out because he didn't want to give Jesse Owens the medal. But Jesse didn't get upset. Jesse went on and broke 3 more world records. And he said, in the evil world in which we live, you have to know that you're going to be surrounded by sick people. Racism is a sickness. And it doesn't help to get mad at him. He was a dentist. He said, somehow you have to figure out a way to help them. Now that's basically what I've done for these last 75 years. And it has been remarkably successful. I never expected justice. I never believed justice was possible in my lifetime. I still don't. But I believe that, as my daddy said, you don't get mad and emotional about it, you get smart. And you find ways to really live by offering your enemy not justice, but mercy. I know that's hard for you all, but take any point in my life that what we did was not seek justice. We sought truth and reconciliation. And that depended on our being willing to offer our enemies a certain level of mercy. And that's the only way we've healed the South. And it's the way South Africa has worked. Now, my problem on a global basis, and this is different from the coal case, I'll get back to that, but on a global basis, the places where we've had most peace is not where we found justice, but where we gave mercy. And it doesn't matter whether it's black or white. We always give white people mercy. I mean, the South Africans who kept Mandela in jail got a Nobel Prize with him. I didn't think that was necessary, but, you know, Ian Smith, who killed people in Zimbabwe by the hundreds, hanged them in City Hall, was forgiven by the people of Zimbabwe and lived to his death in peace right there in Harare. Mugabe, we punish because he asked for land back that whites had taken. So there's so many instances of, well, internationally, I have just found that a certain level of mercy is necessary for reconciliation, and so my peace has to come from within. Now, it's hard talking about this in front of Martin, but when his father was killed, we had a choice. Do we try to track down his killer, or do we try to keep his work going? And we said he would not want us to worry about who killed him. We knew very well what killed him. And it was so institutionalized in the framework of our government that there was no possibility for justice in the death of Martin Luther King. Not at all. To this day, we have all but seen and proven the complicity of the FBI and the military intelligence, and I mean, we got pictures of it. And even in the most liberal Democratic administration we've had, they brushed us off. So but we're still fighting the system that made it necessary for Martin Luther King to be killed. And that system was a system where he challenged the necessity of poor people. He just figured he had, his words are that I have no, well, I have the audacity to believe that all of God's children can have 3 meals a day, adequate education, health care, and can live prosperous lives. And so the dream lives on, but at no point did we stop to pursue justice. Now, that was an individual choice. When I was given a chance to be on the Assassinations Committee in the Congress, in fact, they asked me to chair it, and I turned it down. And because it was a waste of time. I knew there was no way we were going to get justice out of that. And the people who served on it got really burned when they bucked against the positions of the government. And their careers were destroyed. I'm talking about Walter Fauntroy, who was on the committee, and when he began to raise so many questions, there was all kinds of crackdowns on him. I'm not, now, let me stop there and say that that's where that's the situation out of which I come. Now, in individual cases in the South, where there are injustices that everybody's aware of, I think it has been very helpful for the cold case group to seek these out and prosecute them. So that has given peace to some families. But I think what you said about the jails being full, I don't have a whole lot of time to fuss and fight with anybody and don't have less energy. I'm trying to figure out how we get young people out of jail. And I hope any of you who become prosecutors will not pay any attention to anything you see in television, where they throw around 15 to 25 like it's 15 minutes to 25 minutes, and where they destroy people's lives because of some idiocy called mandatory sentences that has given people master's degrees in crime and not justice for anybody. I think we've got to challenge this whole system, but I think we've got to be very sensitive and specifically tactical about what we approach. And right now, the only thing I think anybody ought to be thinking about between now and the 7th of November is the election of somebody that will appoint a Supreme Court and state and appeal court judges that have some sense of justice as has come up through, that we fought a war about. And they're trying to roll things back beyond the New Deal and almost beyond the Civil War in some instances. So I'm giving you a framework for discussing where we are, but I can't expect justice. I have to find peace within myself and stay calm and reasonable and tactical enough to survive. And in order to do that, I have to be merciful toward my oppressors.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. Professor McDonald.
Has to know who has suffered, that we have to somehow deal with the fact that most of us don't know. People who have suffered should not be forgotten, should not have had some measure of addressing the kind of violence, the violence based on racial hatred, because it affects all of us in our moral integrity to forget or ignore those kinds of things. And I don't think Ambassador Young is suggesting we ignore or we forget it all. It is very deeply etched in his memory and his own experience. But I think what we've discovered, and I'll talk about it in the context of the cold case justice families, we have had the privilege and the honor of talking to many people who are not known by the general public and who have experienced these kinds of brutal, horrendous torture, murder, disappearance. And their families have, and the generations of their families have have had to live not only with that wound, but with the wound of saying nobody cared enough to look, to acknowledge that this happened. And so it is a second wounding to the next generation and the third generation and the fourth generation, much as it was and is with the Holocaust and other sufferings in Rwanda and Darfur and other places in the world. And so we've discovered in terms of the cold case families, and it's an experience that Professor Johnson and I have had every day that we're working on this, everywhere we go, everywhere we speak, we are approached by other people who said, let me tell you about my grandfather, let me tell you about my brother, and can you talk to us? And of course we can. But we are overwhelmed at the numbers of those who disappeared or who lost someone and no one ever even recorded it. And so I think there is an important, from the perspective of the civil rights era, and I define the civil rights era in many different periods of time where this has gone on, but in the most recent one that we've been looking at in the 1950s and 60s and beyond, there are hundreds of these cases that have disappeared from the records, that are not acknowledged. And I don't think we acknowledge them in order to increase suffering, but we acknowledge them and do our best, and from our profession as lawyers trying to make some sense of law meaning something, that murder has no statute of limitations, and accountability may need to come before reconciliation and mercy, in the sense of at least acknowledging the kind of suffering that happened and what we as a society and as a nation and as a world are going to do about that in one perspective or another.
Imperative for justice. I think it is predicated on justice. And the work that we do in the Cold Case Justice Initiative has simply cemented that view for me, for many of the reasons that Professor McDonald just expressed. And I will say to you also, excuse me, that one of the privileges we have had is that all of us on this panel took part in something that was extraordinary in April 2010 in Atlanta, and that was the Syracuse University and the Cold Case Justice Initiative had a program in Atlanta in which we invited the families of people who had been killed by this civil rights era racist violence together for a retreat and also a public program. And we all participated in that. But one of the most important aspects of that program was for those families, some of whom have names that are known, but many of whom have suffered without anyone ever knowing what happened in their families or the names of their family members. All of them came together in this private setting. And what we heard from those family members, beyond just the basic gratitude for bringing them together, was the recognition of their pain and suffering and the fact that they had been longing for someone to pay attention to what had happened in their families for 40, now going on 50 years in some cases. No official reaction when their mothers or sisters or aunts or grandfathers or fathers were killed. Nothing said, maybe a blurb in the paper, maybe not. So they were grateful for that. But what they were also grateful for was the fact that they could come together with each other. Many of them said, and I distinctly remember, for instance, in one of our sessions, when one of the family members stood up and he said, I thought my family had been through something until I heard what this woman shared with us. And so in that, it was the expression of what they all had experienced in common, but also their very deep wish that all of them would get some kind of satisfaction, not only internally, but also from the external official sources within this society. But they recognized each other, and we recognized them, and in that there was common bonding. And to me, that is the message of what we are about, what we need to do, that peace must come with justice, and in doing that work. And I'll just say really quickly, too, because my profession, of course, is also law, and it has not always been a noble profession. And there are those of us, or some of us, who are in this profession who are trying to do that differently. And I think that this work also epitomizes that. And something that Mr. King said also about people being unrepresented, and Dr. Carty talking about the criminal justice system. In 1963, there was a very important case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court called Gideon. Many of you all might have heard that. You might have even seen the movie that was done about Gideon. Gideon was the case in which the Supreme Court said that everyone in the criminal justice system had a right to counsel, particularly when they were facing the possibility of incarceration. But 50 years later, in 2013, it will be 50 years, only a fraction of criminal defendants, most of whom, as we have heard, are black or brown and poor, receive legal assistance when they go before criminal courts or immigration hearings or anything in which their liberty, their reputations, their ability to make a living, their ability to be in touch with their families, their abilities to live and connect with their communities might be jeopardized. These things are not protected, despite the fact that the court has said this is a constitutional right. So that is a blot on our profession, and it is something that we all need to change. And if there is going to be any promise of justice, at least in that arena, we have to make major changes in our conception of it and in our responsibility to it. Let me
Trying to learn in this, and there are cases like the case of Medgar Evers, where 30 years later, 35 years later, Byron de la Beckwith was brought to justice. That was a major triumph, not only for his family, but for the whole civil rights movement. And everybody that worked on that, but now fair trials, and now with the presence of DNA evidence, can be brought back to the courts. And I've been working with a young lady who was 15 when she was picked up by a gang, and she witnessed a murder, a savage murder and torture. But she was under 15 at the time of trial, 18 years. And the Supreme Court has decided that children who were involved have black and white. Fortunately, there's a very good warden and a very good chaplain, and the record is that parents who've been incarcerated, I think there's 7 out of 10 of their children who are in jail who ought not be there.
Can I just respond to that a minute? Because I think one of the audience, for the law students who work on the Cold Case Justice Initiative, they come to us as 1Ls, first-year lawyers, and they get into this work and they get transformed. And they're not all going to work on cold cases of how you have to do something. And we need more of our lawyers to do the kind of thing you were talking about. So one way is to get them involved, to stop with just those.
Say amen to that. Yeah. All the lawyers we can transform, I mean.
Not an easy task.
Was there another comment?
I think that Ambassador Young apologized for being old and thinking of this very differently. I would say, let me not apologize for being passionate about these issues. I think we're all passionate in our own different ways, but I work in the school system, for example, in public schools with kids who will never have a chance, maybe, for anything progressive in their lives, and many of whom will end up in these prisons, right? For all kinds of stereotyping that's attached to them already. And I am really, 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 I find this really disturbing. That and what's happening with the women in the prisons, as you said, because most of those women, I have also been in some of the prisons, most of those women have gotten there because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, we can't understand the injustice in the prison system because the lack of education leads to the kids ending up in prisons. If we don't understand...
I mean, I think we have to understand that, you know, violence is caused oftentimes by the structures that exist within our world. And the structures have to be, you know, be changed. And what I mean by that is, you see, I think my dad and certainly his team, Ambassador Young and others, didn't just talk about, you got to have a safety net in place, which is what we think we have, but it's really not a great one at this point. And the safety net is being challenged. But, you know, he used to talk about taking Jericho Road and repaving the entire road, not just, you know, patching it up. So as it relates to peace, we have to look at all the different structures that create violence. Now, you know, I said this yesterday, but I don't think we even realize how inundated in this nation we are with violence. Do we want to understand? If we really want to understand why we are violent, we start off as children watching cartoons. 6 out of 10 of those are violent. I mean, I remember distinctly some of the cartoons that I used to watch as a child, and I'm looking even now. We monitor what our daughter watches, and a lot of parents do, but you got to monitor because, you know, ultimately you embrace how you're socialized. Then we watch regular television, and 6 out of 10 of the television programming is destructive. Now we got all these reality, they call them reality shows. They're shallow and superficial and non-substantive, and yet we are rushing to embrace them because we live in a society that's dysfunctionally functional. Because you know you're dysfunctionally functional when you embrace this kind of garbage and you think it's entertainment. Oh, I want to see some more. And, you know, obviously somebody's consuming it, not necessarily here at Syracuse, but somebody in America is, because it's making a lot of money. Then, you know, we go out and buy video games, and 7 out of 10 of them are about blowing up something and shooting something. Then we go to movies in the theaters, and then again, 6 out of 10 of those. So we're constantly inundated with violence, and so our diet is a diet of violence. If we want to really ultimately get to peace, then we've got to demand something different. And what I was most appreciative of these last couple of days was, number one, to be in the midst of women and men and people who are true advocates of nonviolence and peace, and personify that. You know, Ambassador Young, he's talking tough today, but his spirit, you know, I mean, this man exudes love all the time. Not just, you know, maybe you say, well, you're supposed to do that with me. No, I mean, he does this with everybody. I mean, people are in and out of his house all the time. Now, there are a lot of people, there are people in our world like that. Now, he's not the only one. Unfortunately, we promote something else. We need to be promoting the kind of things the kind of things that His Holiness and the Dalai Lama are stating on a consistent basis, and more people need to see more of that. You know, I'll give you an example. Today we talk about how Oprah Winfrey is not making money yet, they say, because of its programming. And she's deviating a tiny bit. But ultimately, if you look at the programming of OWN, you will see transformative programming that is ultimately going to change the lives of people. in a very positive way. Eventually, I don't know when, that network is going to be successful because it's reinforcing positive energy. And so I think more people want to see that than the garbage that we are consuming right now, because right now we're consuming garbage. And so I think the public also has to demand something differently. We talked about often freedom. Freedom was not just given. Freedom, Dad used to talk about how, the oppressed will never give freedom, but those who are oppressed have to demand that we be treated with dignity and respect. It's just like we can never, I don't think we can weed out terrorism by terrorizing others. When we start treating people with dignity and respect and responsibly, then terrorism will be minimized, not necessarily fanaticism. That's a different discussion, but terrorism. So, while you can't legislate and mandate behavior, we have to understand that the world does not revolve around us. And, we at one time we were a more intelligent nation than we are now. We've been programmed to be dumbed down. And we're dumb and proud. Now, I'm not talking about Syracuse. I'm talking about America. It's stupid. It's as stupid as some of us are uninformed and don't want to be informed. So we got to change that paradigm so that there's a yearning and a desire for information and knowledge and an appreciation of other cultures. Our culture is okay, but it's just one of many cultures. There's so many cultures around the world. People are doing wonderful things to change conditions all the time, but we don't see enough of that. And I just think we need to, I know I got a little bit off your question, but I think we need to see more of that because, I guess I'm just negatived out. I'm tired of negativity.
No, but you and I were in the hotel in India after the Pakistani terrorists.
Yep.
They brought the terrorists to justice, and they improved somewhat their relationship with Pakistan. We spent $1 trillion on a war that did not improve our position anywhere in the world. And I think we have to raise the question, maybe we didn't know it at the time, but if we knew that $1 trillion was going to be spent between Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, couldn't we have found a better way to use it? And we have stopped asking those questions. And I don't know the answer. I just say, couldn't we have found a better way to create peace and justice in that region, knowing now how much money we spent and how many lives were lost?
But I'm back.
We preach peace, but we practice war. That's a little bit inconsistent. And he also used to say that I live in a nation that is one of the greatest purveyors of violence on the planet. That's still true. Now, we can change that, but it has to be we as a people that want to change it. And maybe we don't think about that, but yes, our economy has always been built, recently, in the last 30, 40 years, a military-industrial complex, and it is benefiting someone. Someone is manufacturing weapon systems, and they're making a whole lot of money out of it. So it seems to me we ought to be focused on how do we create a more just and nonviolent system. If we can develop an economy around militarism, we certainly could, because we used to think that every 20 years or 25 years we had to have a war so that it would stimulate the economy. It seems now that with technology, and if technology is taken to its fullest ability, that we could create a different kind of economy, and hopefully we will, that is not predicated on the war mentality. That mentality, it still exists. And unfortunately, others sort of want to emulate that part of us, thinking that they're going to be able to make more money. It was interesting to hear Jim Woolsey yesterday talk about the fact that we are all being strangled essentially by our utilization of oil. And until we get off the dole, essentially, so that those countries that that commodity has made them very successful, have to figure out, okay, how are we going to do something else? He was saying that when that happens, those countries, perhaps the autocratic and dictatorial countries, would transform into a different, perhaps, kind of government, maybe even democracy in some cases. And because we as a world community, you know, we want to, the oil is controlling everything right now, and even, I mean, you know, this is a little necessarily showing that you can blow someone off the planet. There's a way to show strength, and I think my dad and his team and others, Gandhi and others in our society, Corazon Aquino in the Philippines, there have been a number of people in our world. You know, Aung San Suu Kyi, who we just saw here. I mean, they have shown us, Mr. Mandela, have shown us the power of how you can transform a world through a different method. But we believe we have to show our force. So when someone does something to us, we're going to go get them. And that ultimately will not result, in my judgment, in a true transformation of creating peace. It never will.
What we'd like to do, you all,
For moving and impressive panel, and I'm very deeply honored to be able to ask a question. I'm wondering about psychological variables that impact racist and violent behavior within certain institutions that are crucial or central to part of the American government. So, if I'm not mistaken, when Michael Wade Page went on his rampage at the Sikh temple, that he had learned neo-Nazi belief systems and become an adherent while at Fort Bragg. And his acts were preceded by racist murders of black people by active duty personnel. So I can't help but wonder, because the Confederacy was based on terror in a way against black people, why one of the major military bases in this country is named after a Confederate general. I know there's, you know, a lot in a name, I think, that prompts that negative behavior.
The South, in terms of strictly racial.
After 9/11 influenced him, and he and a generation of young men and women thought that's the way to serve their country, and they did it with all good reason and good faith. And then in the economy, you had a lot of people joining because they were looking for you know, a way to make a living in this horrible economy. We have some damaged souls coming back from these wars. And they are struggling with post-traumatic stress and other kinds of the traumatic brain injury because of what they've seen and how they, as young people, are absorbing it and trying to make some sense out of it. And it's a tragedy, and it's something that we're really going to have to address. Because now the military doesn't even need them, so they're shoveling them back out into society too. Also, with the racism in the military, make no mistake about it, this is still ongoing within the military against African American and Latino military members, and it's another part of the myth that we have out there that we need to address. I'd rather not see them go in, but you know, they're in, and they're there for reasons that really we need to think about and help them heal the wounds of what they've experienced.
Have a voice, you should use it, and is it ethical to stand by and say nothing? And we talked a little bit about how we're allowing the voice of sanity and reason, which I would think myself one of those, to be drowned out by fear and ignorance, especially in the election year discourse, as you mentioned, Ambassador. And how do you feel that this fear and ignorance, almost fear-mongering, truly affects our ability to achieve peace in society when we have people spouting this nonsense, and then the voices of reason and logic are being drowned out and ignored by society at large.
Criticized by some of the people in the clergy, mostly white members of the clergy, for bringing the movement to Birmingham, and all of the activism, which included children as well. And he was told, you know, this wasn't the right time, this wasn't the right tactic, this wasn't the right thing to do. There will be justice at some point, but why not wait? And he wrote that letter from a Birmingham jail saying, one, why we couldn't wait, but also the cost that people's silence on all of the injustices and the conditions within our society were allowed to perpetuate because we would not have this project to do had people spoken up, spoken out, when, and so even at a time when people knew what was happening and they were reluctant to say who was participating in these activities.
And if I can get it in my household, I'm all right. I don't think my children treat me fair. I don't think my wife treats me fair. My mother and father gave preference to my brother, so I don't, you know. I've learned to live without justice. Yeah, because the peace, I have peace within, and forgive me for getting religious on you, but the only way, I mean, I just believe God is still on the throne, and I will be at peace no matter what happens, see, and we sing, through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. Was grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. You know, and the Negro spirituals, you talk about people had peace and drive and courage when they were slaves. And the black family held together in slavery better than it's doing now. So I'm saying that in terms of a social order, this is probably the most just one on the planet, as bad as it is.